I'm very happy about this event, during which we want to look at the federal elections that took place last Sunday in Germany. I think they deserve a very particular interest, because although there were this democratic routine that we all know about, they ended a long period during which German governments were headed by one single personality, that was Chancellor Angela Merkel. So we have had quite a considerable participation in these elections. We have now a result, and most probably the Bundestag will have its first constitutive meeting end of October then in Berlin. So what we are going to do now is to have a look on these results. We can't yet see where the government building is heading to, not so clearly. And I thank everybody on the panel who participates. Thank you very much, Gisela Dachs. She is a publicist for various German and international media, among others, the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit and the Swiss Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and she's also professor at the German Academic Exchange Service Center for German Studies at the Hebrew University. We are grateful for you for leading us through that session that we are having now, and for serving us as a moderator. Thank you very much to Yorai Lahav-Hertzano, member of the Knesset for the Yesh Atid party. He is the youngest lawmaker, she's the youngest lawmaker in the Knesset at the moment. Central fields of interest are climate and environment, opportunities for young people and people with special needs, as well as the rights of the LGBTIQ community. Then we have Professor Eli Salzberger, professor of law at the University of Haifa and former head of the Haifa Center for German and European Studies, where he is now a senior lecturer. He taught as visiting professor at various German universities and is a long-term observer and has a particular knowledge of the German-Israeli relations. Then we have Tal Schneider, journalist, commentator. She doesn't need any further introduction. She's at the moment political correspondent at the Times of Israel. And Antonia Yamin, a German-Israeli journalist. She was born in Germany, and she is now living in Germany as the chief Europe correspondent for Car News. So before we start, I want to repeat my gratitude to all of you for being on the panel. And I also would like to extend my thanks to the German political foundations located in Israel, namely the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Hans Seidel Foundation, Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for their input and their contributions to, let's say, the conception of this event, and of course also for their long-standing good cooperation with the embassy. And without further ado, and lots of apologies for these disturbances, I want to hand over to Gisela Dachs. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Ambassador. Very glad to discuss with you. We have an hour, maybe a little bit more, to discuss expectations, hopes, and implications of the German elections that happened last Sunday. And we'll have a focus also on German-Israeli relations. I was extremely lucky because I just spent 10 days as an official election observer with a group of experts in Germany, which is also kind of a unique thing, I think very German, which exists since 1956, that every 4 years they would gather international experts and to show them really around, meeting people, politicians, candidates, think tanks, and so on. So it's very fresh, these very special elections. So before we'll discuss also the role of Germany in the world, focus on German-Israeli relations, what is Germany able to do, what it wants to do, or maybe what it should do. I will give a short overview of where we stand so far, and then I will give each of you time for a short, brief statement. What was your impression or reaction to the results? Then we will have a second round of discussion, and then we would like to open the discussion to the audience. You can send your questions on the chat function of the Zoom meeting. Also, we are not sure how many of the questions we can really then answer, but please do. And there is a short apology from Antonia, who will have to leave a few minutes earlier before the end. So she apologizes in advance. So maybe to give just a very, very brief overview, we really have an era that is over. We had 16 years of Angela Merkel at the head of Germany. She herself didn't want to continue, which is also unique. So you had no chancellor standing for re-election. And time, in a way, was really ripe for change after 16 years. It had been such a long time that boys in Germany, young boys, were asking their parents whether also a man could be chancellor in Germany. So the question still remains, for how much change did the people in Germany really vote? We had a very dynamic and volatile election campaign. It was, on the one hand, a very personalized campaign centered around the 3 candidates, which is also a new thing. We had more than 2. And there were very civilized discussions with each other, as we might be used to in Israel. It talks about very cultivated jokes, talks about climate change, social justice. As I said, what is new, you had 3 candidates competing, and at different times, each of the 3 candidates were at the top during the election campaign. Only at the end, very surprisingly, the Social Democratic Party managed others. And then, in fact, we had very familiar patterns to Israeli ears. You have, on the one hand, the shrinking of really the old established people's parties, which are, even though the SPD made a big jump from the last elections, they both stand more or less, CDU, the party of Angela Merkel, and the SPD at 25%. I mean, unless you would continue the national coalition of the 2 parties, which is somehow excluded, there's a need to form a coalition with more than 3 parties. Also, you had no clear winner at first. 2 candidates wanting to form a government. So also that is kind of new, that there was no clear outcome on election eve. What is clear by now, I think it's good news. You have more or less 4 moderate parties at the center that are together strong, and the parties at the extremes, meaning the far-right AfD and the Linke on the left, they have been weakened. And the interesting thing was, in contrast to the very dynamic election campaign, or at least the polls that were kind of a roller coaster, you had extremely boring candidates. In one of the now the most probably next chancellor or the next Merkel in Germany, with his nice head, and it was written Smurf is the trump card. So Schlumpf is Trumpf. It sounds very nice in German. That in fact, Scholz, who doesn't move very much, is not a very charismatic person, but he radiates seriousness. And in fact, his biggest asset was that he made no mistakes during the campaign, while the others did. But in a way, he is also the natural incumbent. He was, after all, vice chancellor in the last government. He was finance minister under Merkel, and he even makes this rhombus gest, which Merkel became very famous for it when she stands. So Scholz is probably the most probable candidate, or the most probably next chancellor of Germany. And as it looks, it could be a traffic light coalition. That means the Social Democrats together with the Green and Liberal Party. What might be needed here is also something known by now in Israel, a kind of a dissent management, as mainly the Green Party and the pro-business Liberal Party, FDP, have quite different agendas. So this will be very interesting. Short mentioning that foreign policy issues, while it is true that in elections, domestic issues are always more important, but at this time, foreign policy issues have been completely absent from the election campaign. It was very centered, as I said before, on climate change, social justice, inner German issues, so which leaves things open of how much of a change there will be to continue as before. And just to leave you with a very nice description, today it was Alan Pincus, the former Israeli consul in United States, in New York. He wrote about what Merkelism is in his eye, or what it stands for. And he mentioned balance, steadiness, composure, calm, pragmatism, humbleness, seeking compromise, aversion to high risk, fact and science-based policy decisions. So now I'd like to ask you, what kind of things or developments do you expect from now on? Maybe we'll start with Yorai Lahav-Hertzano, please.
Yes. Wait. Now you can see me.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
First of all, Gisela, thank you very much for your kind invitation. It's a privilege to discuss with you about the situation in Germany. I think that it's only proper to open my remarks with a great thanks and appreciation to Chancellor Angela Merkel on 16 years of sheer commitment to Israel-Germany relations, to strengthening our bilateral relations. It's not a common, or it's not trivial to do that. And I think in general, Germany is Israel's best ally in Europe and one of our most important partners in the world. And we share a special and unique relationship, which is based on a rather complex history, but on shared values and a shared commitment to advancing a more conscientious world. Now, I know that as you described, Gisela, there aren't any concise results in the German polls, and yet I can say with absolute certainty that the current government in Israel, which I'm a part of the coalition, will be able to work very good with any government which will be formed in Germany. And I think that we have to work together, or rather advance or promote deepen our bilateral relations, because we have many mutual challenges, and I can maybe point out to three of them. The first one is an alarming rise in anti-Semitism throughout the world, maybe focusing in Europe and in Germany in particular. We need to combat that awful evil together. The second thing is that we need to combat radicalism, in particular Iran, and which is a state harboring of terrorism, and its proxies around the Middle East are spreading their hate and fear throughout the Middle East and all around the world. So we have to combat radicalism in Iran. And the third thing, which we got a hint of it in the elections in Germany, which is dealing with the climate change and combating it with due effort. I think that we have seen a substantial rise in the Green Party in Germany, which maybe it's a hint of the direction where Germany is heading in terms of combating the climate change. And that's and that's
Thank you very much,
so
Yorai. We'll get into that then in the next round. Eli, you have directed the Center for German Studies for a long time at Haifa University, observed Germany for a long time as well. Do you expect any new things now? How do you see these elections?
It's nice, Gisela, that you switch from the youngest panelist to the older panelist. And maybe I'll talk as the older panelist. You know, Israeli-German relations are connected. We just marked last year 1700 of Jewish life in Germany, and Israeli-German relations are part of this 1700 years of tradition. So I don't think that these elections will have an immense effect. There are different clocks ticking. One is the clock of the relations between governments, other clocks between societies and culture. We might talk a little bit later. But as you said, you know, the results of the election basically show healthiness of the German democracy. A moderate party won most of the votes, the extremists lost. The difference between SPD-led Scholz, who is on the right wing of the SPD, and Angela Merkel, left-leaning CDU figure from ideological perspective are not significant. All four parties that will be part of the coalition committed themselves to Israel, and I don't think that the new regime will be very different in with regard to Israel. There will be some nuances, but this will not change the big picture. I think what is interesting in the election results, you know, we talked about age before, is the age groups that were instrumental in the vote. You know, the results were in favor of the SPD because people over 60, like me, shifted from CDU to SPD. The young people voted Green and other and less to the two main parties. And I think really also on the governmental level, it's a matter of generation. Scholz is the same generation as Merkel. We are talking about second or third generation to the Holocaust. And as this generation will rule Germany, the commitment to Israel will remain. What will happen in the next generation? That's a big question, which we might talk a bit later.
Okay.
So that's my input so far.
Thank you very much, Eli. Antonia, your turn from Berlin with us.
Hi, hello. Well, I will talk from the perspective of being here in the election night. I remember it was a very thrilling campaign. I know most of the candidates were boring, as a lot of media outlets also put out there. But I remember that at 2:00 p.m., I was standing with my camera and I was like, where should I stand now? Should I go to the SPD house, Willy Brandt house, or should I go to the CDU? Because as maybe the only Israeli TV journalists in the ground, I didn't want to be at the loser side. At the end, I decided to be at the SPD. But if, as you said, Gisela, there wasn't really there wasn't an outcome. It is pretty much the same, and it is still the same. And even now, how many days we are afterwards? 5 days after the election, and we still don't know who will be the next chancellor. A lot of people in Israel were mourning the fact that Angela Merkel is leaving, of course. And I always told them, wait, she's not leaving yet. She will stay the chancellor for the next weeks, maybe even the next months. In the end, I think that there was, you said it yourself, Gisela, each candidate was on the top of the polls for some time. In April, Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party really had her momentum. Like the polls said, she might get 30% of the votes. People started to describe her as the next chancellor. Then she did a few mistakes, huge mistakes maybe, and the momentum swifted to Armin Laschet of the CDU. And then really at the end, Olaf Scholz from the SPD got like the most, the highest votes also in the polls. But then there was this campaign of CDU, which said Olaf Scholz might maybe sit with the left, with the extreme left, and that would be a disaster for Europe. He said, I also mentioned that it might have changed the relationship between Germany and Israel if that would have happened. But in the end, CDU, SPD, they are both kind of on the same level of points or percentages of the voters. And now there will be a very long coalition talks, which I will, of course, look upon and cover. And we'll see when we will have a replacement for Angela Merkel. But having said that, I agree that the relationship between Israel and Germany won't really change. But in the end, Chancellor Merkel was something special because there was something in her personality that connected her to Israel. When she stood there in the Knesset speaking German and said that Israel is part of the Staatsräson of the security of Israel is part of the Staatsräson of Germany. That was something. And I think that a lot of Israelis really appreciated her, maybe even appreciate her more than what Germans does. And even if the relationship itself won't change, it is a loss that Angela Merkel is leaving us.
Thank you very much. By the way, just for those who might not have followed it, the option that you were just mentioning of a red-green coalition was in the air, but the numbers won't just add up to give enough voices. So this coalition, in fact, is excluded because it wouldn't make add up to a majority in the Bundestag.
Thank God.
So this is why and this is true. In that case, maybe a discussion could have happened about changing relations in the future or not. But now we are standing with a traffic light coalition, and the other option, less probable, is the so-called Jamaica coalition, which means CDU, Green, and the FDP party. Thank you. Let's go now to Yorai again. I'd like to ask you about also in Israel. I mean, we have a new government since a few months. Let's not forget this as well. So we don't have only a change in Germany after 16 years. It happened here as well. And I'd like to ask you about the relations to the EU and especially Berlin. Where I've met Foreign Minister Lapid 2 weeks ago, and where he was pretty clear saying, well, I want to make openings there. It's important for me to be in Brussels. These relations to Berlin, what can you tell us about these relations?
Well, Germany is the leader of the European Union, of Europe itself. And I think that our bridge to the European Union is mainly through Germany. So I think that those ties are interconnected. And Foreign Minister Lapid is now in Bahrain, is not in Europe. But still, I know that he views the relationship between us and the European Union. We have to strengthen them and deepen them, and to understand that we cope with the same issues or challenges, and we have to do it together. I want to address one main issue that Antonia mentioned, because I experienced it myself. Israel underwent 4 consecutive elections in 2 years where we didn't have a concisive outcome. And I think that it's a part of a global trend. I mean, you can see it in the elections in the United States. Maybe Schneider can elaborate, but you can see half the Americans voting for Trump and half plus a bit voted for President Biden. You can see it in Israel, where you have a split parliament between 60 and 60, where you have, for us, it's 60 plus 1 or 2. And you can see it in Germany now. And I don't know what this meltdown means globally in terms of the democratic system, or the trust that the peoples in the world have in the democratic system. But it says that we have to work harder to gain the trust of the people in the system. And I think it requires a lot of attention, because it's a worrying trend. And we have to address it, not lightly.
Yeah, thank you very much. Which brings us really to Tal. Tal, first of all, I'd like to ask you also about your general statement on the elections, but then also to add up in particular about also, well, you're coming just back from the United States. We have been at the UN discussions where Prime Minister Bennett was there. How do you see also the role of Germany in these world affairs?
Yes, hello, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. Indeed, coming back just 12 hours ago from United States, from the UN, with the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who made his first speech at the UN on the last day of the assembly. A main part of the speech was about Iran. This is an issue of the most importance to the Israeli people and to any type of Israeli foreign affairs agenda. I think with the change of government in Germany, a lot of eyes are on the identity of the foreign affairs minister and of the overall agenda with respect to the Iranian nuclear project. Now, obviously, we know in the last years, and since the agreement was signed in 2015, I'm referring to the JCPOA. We knew of German really insisting on the same stance. They didn't like that the United States stepped out of the agreement in 2018. They kept on saying for all of those years, they want the JCPOA to be back on track. Now we might see a negotiation going on between the American administration and the new Iranian president. And I think Germany supports going back to the agreement. From what I understand, Schulz have said in an interview to the Israeli newspaper Globes about a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, he have said that going back into the JCPOA is not because of any economic interests of Germany. It is because they think it's the safest way for Israel to be protected. So I think on this specific aspect, the relationship between Germany and Israel are crucial and very, very important. Also, there is a very important of the submarine deal, the former submarine deal, and any future military procurement. Back and forth between the two countries. In Israel, it's a huge deal. I don't know how it will change or be different with the Greens and the rest of this diverse coalition that may be founded. I understand that the diversity of the new German coalition is. We have a very diverse government as well at the moment. So maybe this is a thing of democracies at the moment when you have so many different people coming together in order to overcome a political. In Israel, we had a huge political crisis. In Germany, it's not a political crisis, but definitely after 16 years of a chancellor, a huge change. You need maybe to overcome this huge shift and change. You need to have different powers together in government.
Well, thank you. You just mentioned that you're watching out who will be the next foreign minister. Although the really foreign policy, also especially when it comes to Israel, is mainly made in the chancellery.
That's true. But Heiko Maas was very present, and he visited Israel several times, and he had really deep connection with many of Israel's ministers. So, he was prominent by himself, and I just wonder who will replace him. So,
what is interesting with the Green Party, as I said before, in the campaign, foreign policy issues didn't play a role at all. The only ones who made it pretty clear that they would like to have stricter relations with Russia was the Green Party. They also asked for more control of arms exports. Mm-hmm. And a more thorough examination of when and where to send soldiers abroad. But in this context, maybe I should mention that President Steinmeier just spoke at the UN Assembly last Friday, which is pretty unusual because German presidents don't speak there on a regular basis. And in fact, what he wanted to tell there, if I read his speech well, that Germany after Merkel will not be so different. Doesn't matter exactly which coalition might follow. And if one wants to sum up what he kind of thinks should be done, he said Germany should be more honest with regard to its possibilities, better choose on where to focus, and to strengthen also its possibilities, capabilities. I think it's always about the role of Germany in the world. Germany, in a way, would like sometimes even to hide behind the fact, saying because of our past, we can't be too active in the world, and it's from abroad where people watch and would like to see Germany even as a stronger actor, which brings us always also to the question: whether Germany is able to play a stronger role also in the Middle East when it comes to Israel. But maybe let's go at this point to Antonia, who told me that she spent quite a while with, if I remember well, Olaf Scholz talking about exactly these issues, right?
And not with Scholz himself. He was a bit busy at that night, but I talked at the election night with a few important members of the SPD. One of them was Susanne. She is the state secretary of Berlin, also from the SPD, and Michael Müller, who is also from the SPD and is the mayor of Berlin. He also sits next to the chancellor. Every time we see these big press conferences regarding Corona most of the time. And I asked both of them if Olaf Scholz will be the next chancellor, if the relationship might change. And both of them told me straightforward that the relationship between Israel and Germany will still stay special. They, of course, mentioned the history of Germany regarding the Holocaust and the World War II and the Jewish nation. But in the end, Michael Müller also told me it's not only the history, it's not only the past, it's also the present and the future, because in that time, since the Holocaust, we became friends. So I really think that no matter which government will be now, the relationship between Israel and Germany won't change immediately. But if we talk about the younger generation and we see whom they voted for, we see that most of the younger generation voted for the Greens and for the FDP. And if we talk about the voters that vote Greens, I think when we look upon these children today in Fridays for Future demonstrations, yes, they are going out to the street because of the climate, but in the end, they are searching for a much more, a world that is much more fair. And I think that these children, they are not so understanding, and they won't be so understanding regarding Israeli policies in the future. And I think that would maybe be the biggest mission of Israel. Becoming friends, explain these children where we stand, because they are not the politicians of today. The Green Party will become probably part of the coalition here in Germany. She didn't succeed in becoming the chancellor this time, but I don't know. Greta Thunberg might be a politician someday, and a German Friday for Future activist that is going out into the streets might be a future chancellor in 10 or 20 years. And that's the focus for Israel, I guess.
Thank you. Which brings me to Eli Beck. I mean, we have, as I mentioned before, also a new prime minister in Israel. So it's a different couple. It will be Bennett/Lapid, Scholz, most probably. Do you expect their change of dynamics?
Well, first of all, Angela Merkel was really a unique chancellor in vis-a-vis at least Israel-German relations. You mentioned Alon Pinkas' piece. I think that he forgot to mention her courage, morality, and conscience. You know, she made some decisions which were very unpopular, looking for the long term. And this is a very important part of her legacy. And of course, part of her legacy is the relations with Israel. But I totally subscribe to Antonia's last words about a matter of generation. You know, Scholz is the same generation. He has a lot of connection with Israel. As a mayor of Hamburg, he had a lot of connections with Israel. And I think that the line in between governments will remain. It's a key question who will be the foreign minister. I understand that if there will be an SPD, Green, FDP coalition, the Greens will ask the foreign ministry, and then maybe Robert Habeck will be the foreign minister. He's also very familiar with Israel. It's actually a second round of a Green foreign minister Joschke Fischer, who started from a very, very different starting point. He was much more anti-Israeli and changed completely during his term. So here we are starting with a very different starting point. But as I said in the beginning, generation and clocks are very, very important. And what Antonia said, that the young generation of Germans, those who didn't, feel, didn't know people from the Holocaust, who didn't know people from that period, will have far less commitment to Israel. And Israeli societies and German societies are getting apart. Israeli society is getting more religious and more right-wing. German society is progressing to more liberal directions. And the other clock, the third clock, which was very, very instrumental, was the individual ties between Israelis and Germans. In the 70s, it was only governments and countries and legacies, as from the 80s and 90s, and especially in the new millennia, the connection between Israelis and Germans, young Israelis and young German, was vibrant. And I think that this is the key to the future relations of Israel and Germany, to engage the young generation to continue this dialogue, which I hope also will influence the course of Israeli society.
Thank you. I mean, just to remind the audience that you can ask questions in the chat of the Zoom, so that we can relate to that. Please don't hesitate to do that. Otherwise, we continue to discuss among ourselves. What I found fascinating that you mentioned just right now, Joschke Fischer, Eli, because he really came many, many times to Israel, and he was also one of those figures who really conquered Israelis with his talks, charisma, and he was an unlikely candidate for that in the beginning, with all his history and past. And really, I remember at Tel Aviv University, when he gave a speech, they had to add several screens outside because at the time there was no COVID. The big auditorium was packed with people wishing to hear him in person, which was a kind of unusual event. And then also from the outside, people just wanted to listen to him. So that is really an interesting development. But let me go back to Tal with this question again about having a more active Germany on the international scene area. You mentioned before Iran, these kind of issues. Are there expectations, or as President Steinmeier, who used to be also foreign minister, kind of said, one needs to also recognize limits of one's own capabilities and abilities, even if they have to be strengthened?
Well, I think, Israel is well aware of the German attitude. But what we have at the moment is a new government here. Our prime minister is not a world-known figure, and he just has a fairly small party. So I think international cooperation is very important to him. Building his stand in the world and meeting world leaders, I think it's of a highly importance. So we just saw him in the UN. He chose to travel twice in a month to the United States, once to visit with President Biden, a first meeting between them. And I'm sure that as soon as the German government will be in place, the Israeli counterparts will be looking for, way forward and interpersonal connections. On the other hand, a very well-known traditional issue is the Palestinian issue. And I think it's maybe important to European counterparts and to Germany as well. But on that front, there is probably nowhere to proceed with the Israeli side, because we have a diverse government here coming from the left liberal, Greens, Meretz, Labour, and so on, but all of them small parties. And all the way to the right wing, to the very far right wing, that's the party of the prime minister, but also we have in government other right-wing parties such as Victor Lieberman's party and Gideon Sa'ar party. We all call them by the name of the leaders because the political map here is so volatile. Anyways, at least half of this government doesn't want to do anything on the Palestinian side. The other half maybe wants to do stuff, and they agreed when they set up the government. This is only a 3 months government, baby steps. They agreed when they set it up not to move the needle on the Palestinian issue. So, and world leaders, as it seems up until now, are very well aware of the situation. So you see the American administrations making a promise not to touch the Palestinian issue until this government passes a budget, something that will make it stable. And I suppose the Germans may as well, look forward to see how this diverse government is working and not make any changes, not rocking the boat. So until now, I don't see any ability to maneuver the Palestinian issue. That's a huge problem if you want to have stability in Israel at the moment.
Maybe before I go to Antonia, Yamin, to also talk with her about the Jewish community in Germany and the new government in Germany, or that might happen, I'd like to ask Yorai maybe to react to what Tal just said. I mean, do you expect a different course once Yair Lapid will take over the helm of the Israeli government? How is this diverse government trying to deal with these issues, and maybe having Germany as somebody in the background saying, well, you might better do something, and talking together with Joe Biden? I mean, there is also a rapprochement between the United States and Germany after all these years under Trump.
I think that Tal Schneider was very accurate in describing the situation where a diverse government is focused on promoting the things which are agreed upon and discussing the things which we have disagreement on. And I think that it's a new perspective for politics in Israel and in general, that we can have disagreements and we can sort them out, and it's okay to compromise. Compromise is not a bad word, and it's a very important value. I wanted to address what Tal and Eli and Antonia said about the young generation. And as a young legislator, I think that we need to make more connections on the things that are interesting to the younger generation, which are social issues and climate change. And yet I want to maybe mention one expectation that we have, that I know Foreign Minister Lapid and Foreign Secretary Blinken are very keen on, which worries me as a young legislator, is how various countries in Eastern Europe, mainly Poland, are treating the Holocaust and the Holocaust remembrance. I don't know if you know, but Poland is promoting laws which are, in a sense, are a denial of the Holocaust and are depriving the Holocaust survivors and their children restitution from what was taken from them through the Holocaust. I think it's a very worrying trend. Israel, the government of Israel and the foreign minister has expressed his concerns about it. I know Secretary Blinken from the United States has expressed the same thing. And I think that one of the pillars of our shared commitment is to a more conscientious world and to remember what happened in the past, which won't happen again. And I think that in that regard, I think that we look forward to cooperation with the next foreign minister of Germany on combating this worrying trend. As a young person, I'm very troubled by this worrying trend in Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Yeah, Antonia, there are two things. I mean, you just mentioned the younger generation, and there was a poll about what kind of issues are most important for the young generation when they make up their mind of how to vote. And then you had really these two things: human rights and climate change. So these are issues that don't go very well together necessarily with occupation or the Middle East conflict here. And then my second part of the question is, are there any reactions in the Jewish community in Germany that you might want to mention here? There was also an article in Haaretz that a kind of a mourning for Merkel, who was very much beloved. How do you see these things?
Well, regarding the younger generation, I think that I said it before, Israel has to focus now on these children. She needs to explain herself maybe more to them, because I guess that they won't be that understanding of Israeli policy regarding the Palestinians as the German government is today. And regarding the Jewish community in Germany, well, I think that they are pretty happy that the AfD lost a bit from the votes. I remember that before the election, the Jewish community, the Zentralrat of the Jewish community, and also a lot of organizations in the Jewish community, like Vitzo and sport organizations, they issued a press release regarding the fact that AfD shouldn't be elected, and that it is very dangerous. I also think that the Jewish community is very happy that Die Linke, that the left party didn't make it this time. And in the end, the Jewish community will be okay with Olaf Scholz or with Armin Laschet. I think that we also saw in the last war between Israel and Gaza in May, the fact that both candidates were very fast in reacting. Maybe Armin Laschet was a bit faster than Olaf Scholz in regards of acting and saying where their hearts lie. They were very fast in saying that they stand in solidarity with Israel. And when this war between Israel and Gaza was finding itself in the streets of Germany, when people started to attacking Jews, I think that both candidates also said that they are against anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism is something that in Germany you have to be ashamed of, especially after the Holocaust. Of course, that I should say maybe that as a correspondent, I am living now and covering Germany for 4.5 years. Politicians often say the right words, and I really believe them. I really believe them that they want to stop anti-Semitism, but for somehow it doesn't stop. And anti-Semitism is not something new. And I think that that's maybe the task of the future politicians of this country, to really find a way of taking anti-Semitism. They can't just make it disappear, but work regarding this issue, because just words and just saying all the time that they condemn it won't really help.
Thank you. I mean, talking about this younger generation, we just have a question coming in, which is in fact addressed to Yorai, referring also to the young generation who voted massively for the second biggest German parties, the Free Democrats, the Liberal Party, and the Greens. They also had their clashes during campaign times. And they are the first ones now to start coalition talks with each other, agreeing in a way with whom to go, whom to make chancellor. So the question comes from Julius von Freitag, who is heading the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Jerusalem, which is affiliated also with a Free Democratic Party. And in fact, he asks you whether you can advise German politicians how to find compromises, one with the other party, where you have experience how to form diverse, in fact, governments. Is there anything that you could give them on the way?
Well, I personally don't have experience. The person who was the architect of this government after 4 consecutive elections is Yair Lapid, and I think he's the one who we need to give credit for the establishment of this government. But what I can say to Julius, who's a friend, is to try to adopt a policy or a state of mind where this agreement or discourse on values is not a bad thing. I mean, on a daily basis, I have disagreement with members of my coalition. I have severe gaps with some of the members, and it's okay. It's okay to have disagreements, and reaching a compromise is not a bad thing. It's not a rude term in politics. And I think this is our government, which is rather stable now. I think we are heading to affirming the state budget after 3 years where Israel didn't have a budget. And I think it's going to go to pass, of course, and go very smoothly. And I think that's the proof that you can have compromises and you can have discourses, and at the same time you can sit together and promote the things that you agree upon. Because when you think about it, we agree on 80% of all things. And so if we can achieve 50% of those 80%, then it's fine.
Is there a secret how to make things work?
That you have to speak. You have to acknowledge that this person in front of you is a valuable person, and that you can bridge disagreements by discourse. And I think that we got used to politics that if you don't agree with me, you're against me and you hate me. And I think that our government is a live proof that it's okay to disagree. It doesn't mean that I hate those who don't agree with me. It just means that we have to sit down for a coffee or a cup of tea, depending on your preference, and discourse.
Well, thank you. That's interesting. There are also, I mean, several members of both parties, the Green Party and the Liberal Democratic Party, where there are strong personal connections between the politicians. They have gone to school back together.
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, we threw away billions of euros on 4 consecutive elections that resulted in pretty much the same outcome. And I think that you have to have the leadership to say, my values are important as well as the others. And we need to reach a compromise that will enable us to move forward together. And so in Germany case, I don't worry that you'll go to another election. But I think that if I need to provide Julius with an advice, to breathe, to take a breath, and to sit down and speak with your opponents, and to understand that you have a more solid, understanding and common ground than it may appear.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. As we are coming to a close, and I would like to give to the ambassador still the ending words, let's maybe each of you having reactions to that and a concluding round at the same time. Antonia.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I really have to run. I have a live broadcast in 5 minutes. So I had a pleasure, and it was an honor to be here. And let's make Israel-Germany relationship great.
Thank
you so much. Thanks.
Eli.
I think that despite the similarities with regard to coalition forming, the Israeli situation is very different from the German one. And in the Israeli case, it was really, we were on the cliff on democracy. And this coalition of very, very different people is a great savior and a very important educational exercise that we are conducting. Germany, and we have to remember that, the German politicians grow up together in the district parliament, and then in the city parliament, and then the Bundestag. It's a very, very big advantage of the system, that it's the same people who grow up together and start debating from very, very early stages. So deliberation and compromise is much easier there. And I think that, as I said before, the results, the coalition discussion actually shows that among many other countries whose democracy is deteriorating, German democracy is healthy. And what we have to maintain is the long-term relation, especially of the younger generation, to maintain also the healthiness of Israeli democracy and to maintain the excellent, fantastic special relation between Israel and Germany.
Thank you, Tal. Maybe a few last words about, it's kind of funny that we're really talking about what we can learn from each other, or differences and similarities, and there are limits to that as well. What is your take on that?
Well, yeah, interesting times. I think Israeli public is looking forward to see who is going to be, heading the German government. I just may say that, in this era of polarization, it's, I think, it's been said by our Prime Minister in the UN speech that the era of polarization with the social media brings lots of problems to the way democracies are functioning. And I completely agree with the professor that Israel is not in the situation of Germany. It is a much more delicate situation and problematic situation here. Yet we are now exporting to the world the concept of let's overcome the social media polarization and the social polarization with a diverse government. The experiment, I mean, President Biden called it the experiment, referring to the Israeli new situation. I think the experiment has just begun, so we don't know if it is going to worsen the social rift or it's going to heal the wounds. But again, looking at Germany, and again, we are smaller and maybe a little bit less important, but it's very interesting to follow if there is a world trend here about how did you overcome these problems in this modern era.
Thank you. So I guess we will all watch and follow very closely the developments in the next weeks or days in Germany to see how the Green Party with the Liberal Democrats will decide together with whom to go and on what basis. But I think there will be definitely pragmatism will be needed, and it looks like that they are really ready for that. So yeah, could further to be seen how much one can learn from each other on that basis, even though there are really many other differences. So thank you very much. I would like to give at this point the last words to the ambassador, Susanne Wasum-Rainer, please.
Thank you, Gisela, and thank you to everybody. I think it was a fascinating and rich analysis of the outcome of last week's elections, and it gave us also a good perspective of what to expect in the future of the government that is going to be formed. There were many things for my ambassadorial ears that are very happy to hear. Your positive appreciation of the relationship between both our countries, your positive words on this chancellor Germany had for the last 16 years, and the trust in the cooperation between both our countries. I think the word that we heard about the what we can learn from this new government in Israel, to value opinions of also of the political adversary, and to listen and to speak and to stay open for compromise, that is something that is very important also for Germany. I mean, we are all kind of fighting against populism and listening only to the people in our bubbles in the social media. I think this is a virtue that deserves to fight for. And I mean, very last sentence, Germany and Israel, I think we belong to the same precious group of liberal democracies and shared values. And I think this is the basis from which our two parliaments and our two governments will have to continue to work, with a special focus also on young generation and the emotions that are involved in our unique relationship between Israel and Germany, that consists also of Holocaust remembrance that was mentioned too. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.